Join hands and circle to the right. Into the circle and back. Turn your partner. Head couples forward. Back is a line. Balance. Cross through. Turn on your own. Balance. Cross through. Turn to your partner.
Welcome back to another episode of the Radiant Others Klezmer podcast. My name is Dan Blacksburg, and I'm recording as usual from my West Philly basement, bringing you another conversation between myself and one of the awesome, amazing, deep, passionate, obsessed even people who make up our incredible Yiddish music, Yiddish cultural landscape. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to someone I've known for pretty much the entire time I've been involved in this world, which is dancer, scholar, leader, teacher, visual artist, artistic director of Klez Canada, Avia Moore. Avia, like I said, is someone I met at one of my first klezmer programs, Klez Canada 2003, and we're still with it together. It's crazy. I love it so much. And, you know, I love this conversation because we actually get to root it in Avia's scholarship, in her PhD that she did in theater, dance, and performance studies, which she was awarded from New York University. And she talks about this whole idea of this Yiddish cultural scene and how we create our own story and we have to bring together disparate fragments. We have to bring these things together in ways that would have never been possible or even would have made sense maybe to the people who made them. And that kind of comes under this big umbrella term, post-vernacular. Maybe I'm not doing it justice, but I think there's something in it where we have to deal with all this information in a different way. And then that becomes the new way. That's what Avia says. And that's what we talk about a lot. And it's just a sweet conversation between me and someone who I've just known and worked with and just been in community with for really my whole adult life. And that's beautiful. It's brilliant. I love it. And that's why I love doing this podcast. I love being able to share myself, my friends. But the fact is that my colleagues, my friends, my livelihood, like the things that give me joy and let me move forward in life are all just really intertwined in this beautiful way. And that's why I love being able to share these episodes and these conversations with you. It means a lot to me. And I just always keep saying, I love doing it. I want to do more of it. We could always use your help. So we could always use your support, rate, review, whichever. Leave us all those stars. Every star you can find on whatever podcast platform. Write us a review. Share the episode on your social media platform of choice if you're still using those. And email it to your friends. Write down the link on a piece of paper and mail it to your great grandparent or something. And or you can support us financially on Patreon, which is patreon.com/radiantothers. And maybe someday we'll actually have some special Patreon subscriber only content, but for now, just do it because you need us, because you love what we're doing, and we love you, and we're just so grateful. I'm so grateful to everyone who listens, but to everyone who makes their lives and this Yiddish culture and this exploration of our diaspora, Judaism, and all of the richness, the contradictions, the mess. I love the mess. All of it just a deep part of who we are. That's what this is all about. And I think that is really what this conversation is all about in some ways, or a lot of ways, or all the ways. So without further ado, thanks so much. And here's my conversation with Avia Moore.
Sides, face, grand square. 1, 2, 3, turn. 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 Reverse. Turn. Turn. Turn and home. Asya 1, greet your corner.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of Radiant Others, and I'm so happy to be here with my good friend from everywhere, but currently Montreal, Avia Moore.
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is. I was just saying, we just don't get enough chances to, talk about you as a creative human being, because you're always given so much to make things happen for us, for me, for other people. But yeah, like before we started, you were talking about visiting Klezmerkirke. So I had the incredible experience of visiting Klezmerkirke as an artist in February 2020. That was a trip. But yeah, so like, what else? What else have you been up to as like a performer or a teacher, or like, what's your creative practice going like these days? What's been good?
What's been good? Well, Klezmerkirke is always a joy. That was last year, actually. And I think
Oh
that
yeah.
was my February or March 2024 already. And that was my third time going there. And it's always such a joy to return into a community and get to see how they're developing as a community and as a Yiddish cultural scene. And I can't believe it was already a year ago.
Oh yeah, that'll happen.
The past year has been slightly quieter for me as far as a hands-on creative practice because I was focused on finishing my PhD dissertation. But even through that, I have the joy of teaching Yiddish dance, at Yiddish New York, at Klez Canada, at smaller events like Klezmerkirke, or I should say local events like Klezmerkirke. And this spring, I'm excited to be sort of have the time and space to go back into a fuller dance practice. I'm going to Europe. I'm going to be at Freelingtage, which is curated by Esther and Moritz in Austria. I'll be
Oh,
doing a
cool.
Yiddish Tanzhaus in Berlin in early May with Shtetl Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing a few local dance events in Montreal as well. And then as part of sort of bringing all my hats together, as it were, the focus at Klez Canada this summer is on dance. So it really is a chance to think about dance practice, dance scholarship, and bring Yiddish dance to the forefront of the conversation as part of the interdisciplinarity of the cultural scene, but often it gets shuffled into its own stream rather than brought to the forefront of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's about time. And you and I are going to be artists together at a weekend in Vancouver at some point soon. Potentially after this episode airs, we never know. But yeah, but what it sounds like, and I know this to be true, is that you actually did finish your dissertation and you got it done. And so Mazel Tov, that is
Thank
a
you.
serious deal. I know it's been a large part of the time that we've known each other, which, as we were just discussing, is quite a long time.
Well, actually, if we put it in relationship to the time we've known each other, it's still not the large part of that time, but it has
Oh,
been
good.
a serious endeavor of the past few years that really took, as anybody who's gone through this process knows, a lot of time and a lot of energy.
Yeah. One of the things that I was struck by reading it was how much it just reminded me about how much when you write a dissertation, you have to be able to talk about everything. You can't just like have a conversation where you only have one or two topics. It's like, well, this topic points to 12 other topics, and I will now cover them in as much detail as I can, given the space.
Exactly. There's something about a PhD in which you are it's a hyper niche project, right? You are constantly having to narrow it down and be specific. You are an expert at one particular field and even an expert at a subtopic within a niche field already. But at the same time, you have to be able to speak to all of the intersecting fields and disciplines that it relates to. So it's both a micro and a macro approach to a subject.
What a perfect opportunity for a Yiddish cultural worker, creator. Isn't that what we do already?
It is what we do already, and I think it also speaks to, this cultural scene, perhaps more than any other I've encountered, has a very high concentration of scholars, both within and without academia, right? Or within and beyond academia. We have very serious researchers who are not within the academic structure, but there's also so many artist practitioners and scholars who have written dissertations, are serious scholars within the academic structure.
Right, right. No, I feel as though being sort of an academic scholar in terms of wanting what your tiny niche does to somehow be able to point you towards everything else is something that feels very natural to me in this world. Although I would say that probably collecting all those things and all the citations and all the writing is not something that I've spent a lot of time with. Although I'm sure it's just a matter of getting your spreadsheets in order.
Yes, there are definitely there's a lot of tracking.
Yeah. How else would you do it? Well, that's great. So, okay, maybe we can just dive into that because considering it's been the big project of your last year, and also because I think it's a really interesting and useful framing of us. Before we were recording, I was just thinking that this is just a great opportunity to talk from ourselves rather than to have to talk about anything. And it's I think you do that really well in Tradition is Dead, Long Live Tradition, Critical Approaches to Post-Vernacular Yiddish Culture. And, I was in the park yesterday playing with my child, and this person I've known since high school who's a scholar of something and also very Jewish engaged was there with his kids. And we were just talking, and I actually threw out this post-vernacular word, and he was like, "You're sounding a lot like my dad. I don't like it, but I respect it." It was, and you addressed this head on right in there, how confusing it is to be involved in Yiddish culture, in the klezmer world, in Yiddish land, in the klezmer revival. And I'm using these pauses to sort of denote the air quotes that I always feel like I want to put around so many of these topics. And it's and then there's this idea of post-vernacular, which you said a lot of people kind of, as you've also said in there, how many articles are there that's Yiddish is dead? Oh my God, is Yiddish alive? And all of us who are just doing this every day or most days, or at least a lot of days of the year, are just going what? Can we talk about what we're actually doing? Not just this kind of weird meta level conversation that also is just zombie. It's like a zombie conversation. So start wherever you are. And I'm just thinking about this post-vernacular word post-vernacular. It's a framing that's been useful for me to sort of figure out what it is I do and how it matters and how it fits.
So a post-vernacular, as we know, and without getting too much into the history of the word, comes from Jeffrey Chandler, who coined the term in his book Adventures in Yiddishland already more than 20 years ago. So it's a term that's been floating around, more than floating around, being sort of actively incorporated into work in the Yiddish cultural scene over the last 20 years, and has been really pivotal for me in the way I understand the work that we all do as teachers, as performers, as researchers. And I take the post-vernacular in a slightly different direction, in that I'm suggesting that the post-vernacular is, in fact, the vernacular of the contemporary Yiddish cultural scene, right?
Sure, that makes sense.
It is the language with which we speak. And I also consider that not just in terms of Yiddish language, but all aspects of what we do. So thinking about what does it mean to say post-vernacular Yiddish dance, or post-vernacular Yiddish music, or post-vernacular klezmer? How does that change our relationship to the work we're doing? And for me, the post-vernacular has been very freeing in that it creates space for more of a relative relationship with these cultural practices, in which we can think about ourselves as subject, our own positionality, how we've come to them, how the culture has been transmitted to us, how we are then going out and transmitting that culture. So it creates this space for a subjective and contingent relationship with these cultural practices. And I think the other thing that it creates space for, you spoke to the sort of circular argument over whether Yiddish is alive or dead, right? And we're all pretty tired of that binary mode of expressing Yiddishkeit. And the way that many of us experience Yiddish within the scene is a longer path of continuity and change. And building off of a quote from Rebecca Schneider, who's a performance studies scholar at Brown, she asks the question, if we are encountering something that is a trace of something else. So whether that's something from the archives, right? That is, somebody might say, well, that's dead culture because it's in an archive, right? But isn't it live every time we touch it, right? If I
it's
am
like reading
living,
a book.
Exactly. So Yiddish language and culture is live in every moment that we encounter it, whether we're working with archival materials or creating new materials.
Yeah, no, this makes so much sense. And it makes me think about how folks like, Henry Sapoznik and, High Sandy Goldman and all these other folks have in their own ways through these festivals, which is also a big focus of your research and our lives, let's be honest, is that, you're consciously constructing culture. And I'm sure I've said something like this on this podcast many times. You're consciously and, actively constructing the context for having this kind of engagement with the culture. Whereas, I guess a vernacular culture would be something like where you don't have to do any kind of like active work. The passive work of just being around the people in the culture might be sort of indicative of like a vernacular experience or something like that. But, the other thing about a post-vernacular thing that makes me think about what you're talking about subjective, about like sort of meeting it where you are, every time you engage with it, you are, actually like having a living, breathing engagement with the culture. It actually makes me think about how it's an empowering thing for me because it makes me feel validated in my own experience with Yiddish culture, where I didn't grow up with it, where I have not had the opportunity to seriously study the language, where I create this style of performing the music out of my own ideas based on a really, really scant few amount of resources and these sort of scattered mentorship experiences, And so you could, in a way, it's very improvisational. It's very created. I'm sure it was always like that. They're just like, Yiddish was just a language you talk to each other in. Even if you weren't like in the sort of Haredi world where today there are still many, many, many people, we got to remind any of those people with that stupid argument. There are many people who learn Yiddish either as their first or second language and use it all the time. And you don't only have to go to Brooklyn for it. You can also get it in other places, Montreal being one of them. But like, yeah, we get to be ourselves because what we do is also a valid and living engagement with this whole tradition and culture, right?
Exactly. And I think that it raises a couple of points, that I've been thinking deeply about, as have many of us. And one of them is that a key critique of the post-vernacular that I have heard, especially when I teach it, that I hear from students when I teach the idea, is that it is a watered down version of culture, right? That the post-vernacular is just the sort of stereotypical superficial aspects of the culture, the bag with schlep on it, or the sort of Yinglish that persists. However, that is not my experience of the post-vernacular within the Yiddish cultural scene, where actually those who are engaged with the scene are looking at it through a very analytical, questioning, critical thinking standpoint, right? And that has been, for me, and as I embarked on my PhD research, I was interested in asking questions about what the artists, scholars, practitioners of Yiddish culture today, particularly what I define in the dissertation as our cohort, that is,
Yep.
those who grew up within the festival environment created by what we think of as the klezmer revivalists, right?
Yep.
Those for whom our Yiddish cultural education was significantly defined by our experience at festival events. So how is that cohort, of which you and I are both members, how do we approach culture? And the post-vernacularity to us, as you just said it, is freeing, but it doesn't take away the deep cultural study that is necessary for engaging in the work. And in the interviews I did for this research, what I found was that everybody I talked to was engaged in a very deep way. There was no superficiality to it. And that is not to say that everybody who is part of the wider Yiddish cultural scene is engaged in that way, but I was particularly looking at those who are performing, teaching, studying, who Karen Aviv and David Schneer would call professional, people who consider themselves professional Jews, again with air quotes around it, right?
Right, because you don't have to be professional and you don't have to be Jewish. You could, because it's like, it's not, do I make all my money at klezmer music? Not quite. And like, do you? Not quite. Like, like in a way, it's like, and so many of us do other things, Varetsky Pass, talk to those folks about how they, how they put together a living in their own way. Cookie was a member, and Adrienne Greenbaum, who was on this recent episode, she teaches classical music and other kinds of, non-Jewish music, and she throws in Jewish music in really cool ways. But yeah, it's a funny thing. But okay, so one of the things that this reminds me of so much is this way that jazz was taught. I think, I'm not totally sure about this, starting with sort of our generation in the States, where you had this move to create this canon of jazz that was sort of based on decades. So, they say the 20s were swing, and the 30s were big band, and the 40s were bebop, and blah, 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 blah. And the 70s didn't really exist. I actually have friends who went to jazz school who, one of my friends, he's told me about his music history of jazz, and they got to the 70s and they said, we're skipping this. There's nothing important that happened in the 70s, which is one of the stupidest things that anybody has ever said about the history of jazz. And like later I've come to think about this as a very, very, very clear political move. And one of the things is that it was reasserting a hierarchy of black practitioners of jazz into the music, where I think, so you hear about Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington first, and then you hear about someone like Benny Goodman or Frank Sinatra later, which I do not think was the experience of, like, let's say, white people learning about jazz or experiencing jazz back in those days. Potentially, not sure, but it also reminds me of the fact that Ray Musiker told me in an episode we put out that, like, sort of like the moment his relatives got off the boat from Eastern Europe, so to speak, they started to try to play American music. They were just like, I think there's this thing in what you said about people experiencing this sort of idea of what we have now as being less than or watered down or not real, is really supposes that there was something real somewhere else. Now, I don't disagree that, again, it's like it could have been a slightly more passive part of your life, right? If you spoke Yiddish, if you just learned Yiddish from growing up around people speaking Yiddish, you didn't have to learn it through a college class. It's a more passive part of your life, right? But the idea that, like, let's say Jews weren't pursuing assimilation in America from the moment they got here, that's not true.
Right.
I mean, everybody was doing different things.
Yeah, we have to analyze the myths and the stories that we have told ourselves, right? And I don't say myths in a negative way here. In fact, I think of myth making and as a key part of culture. It's part of the human experience. We tell ourselves stories to help ourselves understand ourselves, but we have to critically analyze the myths that we're telling ourselves, and in order to be able to shape the stories and the directions we're going in, right? So, for example, this myth of an origin point, or the myth of an authentic moment that we should be, that defines what is authenticity, or what is authentic klezmer, what is authentic Yiddish dance, right? That idea of authenticity is a myth, because there was no fixed static point at which it was ever one thing. So we can think, oh, I am studying, Yiddish theater in the 1920s, and we can get a really good understanding of a snapshot of something at a certain point, though even then you have to look at different geographic contexts, right? But there is no Yiddish theater was always this, or Yiddish politics was always this,
Definitely not.
I mean, like, we have been arguing about what is Yiddish culture, what is Yiddish politics, what is Yiddish music, what is Yiddish dance, for as long as any of those things have existed by other names,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Like, at that point, 100 years ago, we weren't arguing what klezmer music was, because the word was not necessarily being used in the same way. We certainly the word Yiddish dance was not being used in that way. These are contemporary constructions to help us understand a field. However, the very fact that it's a contemporary construction should give us like a little flag that it was always a construction, right?
Yeah, it doesn't guarantee that there was any essence there to be found. It's just people being people and coming together in collective action that creates cultures. I mean, the thing that just occurred to me is I remember Josh Horowitz talking about of Varetsky Pass, but he had a lot of other bands, including this band Budowitz, that was based in Europe, even though he's American, and he was focused on repertoire from, at that point, 80 to 100 years ago in the 1980s, and he brings it to Klez Camp, and the practitioners, the so-called pre-vernacular people from, like, let's say a Sid Beckerman or Pete Socolow, who have been playing klezmer for so long, they just go...
I don't think it's pre-vernacular.
Whatever, that's right. Okay, thank you. But just like the people who are authentic, quote unquote,
Yeah.
more air quotes, the authentic cats go what the hell is that? That's not our music.
Yeah.
And it's so in a way, our sort of post-vernacular thing exposes us to a much vaster array of information and points of view than the one, and maybe that's one of the dividing lines, right? Maybe it's that you can sort of have this bird's eye point of view because you don't have a place that you're going to get plugged into just because of where you are, where you were born and who you are.
Yeah. That reminds me of as I tried to define sort of our cohort, I initially was trying to ask the question, what are we doing differently? Because you have to have a starting place. You have to have a question you ask that starts you off. And in most ways, I had to let go of many of my starting questions, which we can get to. But one of the things that came out, in particular from my interview with Sarah Gordon, another friend of ours, but from other interviews as well, was that the reference points that our cohort has, and cohorts after us, because we are not the youngest cohort anymore.
No, we are not.
But that our reference points have changed because of the work that was done by our mentors and before them, right? So we come into the scene and we are presented with this huge amount of material and collection and structural research that has put that material into context with other material, and we are gifted that. We're also
totally
given so much time and generous attention from our mentors, right? And that's just laid out in front of us. At the same time, the world of online access changes intensively. So all of these archives are going online that you don't actually have to go to YIVO to get into, you still need to go to YIVO for some of the archives, but some of them are like the Ruth Rubin archive is now just online, right? It's so much
go
easier
check
to
it out.
access. And so that is a major shift. And of course, it affects more than just us, but it is a major change that happens as we are coming into the scene. And
Yeah.
and I think that one of the things that that does is that we have to learn, not only do we have to study the material, but we really have to study how the material goes together, because there's so much of it that it's very easy to not be a specialist, right? You can learn a huge amount of repertoire without necessarily learning that that repertoire is coming from a tremendous geographic area. And then you can think, oh, well, that's all just, Jewish repertoire from this particular time period, where actually the people might not have necessarily have known repertoire across geographic expanse.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so we are forced to learn how to put those fragments together. So yeah, so I spend a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to assemble fragments, right? And
Yeah.
how, what is the work that happens in juxtaposing materials, whether they are meant to sit next to each other or whether we're bringing them together in new ways. And that took me down a lot of really, what to me were very exciting philosophical pathways about fragments. And yeah, it turned into there was a lot more philosophy that became part of the thought process than I necessarily expected at the beginning. And I also thought a lot about, what happens between archival material and performance of that material. Like what is the gap that happens between performance and reperformance?
Right.
And how does what happens in that space move culture in a particular direction? And what are the decisions we're making in that space that bring our own cultural identity into it? You spoke about how, at the beginning, about how we're all coming from different places and infusing this material, feeling empowered to infuse this material with our own positionality, our own cultural identities, right? Which is really exciting. But I think that I look around and I see people making very deliberate choices about what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that because, like you said, these are fragments, even whether you're talking about something it just makes me think about how little audible klezmer trombone there is in the old recordings. You really got to dig deep. And yeah, Jews are used to dealing with fragments, at least Jews of, let's say, the, post, World War II period. But usually people have struggled to get past the feelings of the loss or the feelings of the rupture or the feelings of all this thing. And so they sort of go, well, there's only fragments, and so I've just been so grateful to be a part of a community that says, okay, this is what we've got. Let's see what we can make out of this. And then spin, like you said, new myths, burst old myths, put it all together in different ways and in so many different ways, casually include yourself or very deliberately include yourself or your other experience, music. For me, I think about the music, your other musical languages or experiences. But yeah, so one of the things I wanted to sort of what if we kind of rewind a little bit for you, and how did encountering this whole, world of Yiddish culture and all this stuff, did it create a story for you? Did it change a story for you? Did it change your story, your shattering of yourself? And then what, all these things, these philosophies, what were some of the decisions that you've made as you've delved deeper?
Yeah. Well, I would say to start, just to go back to what I call my origin myth for a minute.
Yeah.
No one is more surprised than me to find myself working in a Jewish leadership position, whether that's as an artistic teacher or in my role as artistic director with CLES Canada, or teaching cultural theory within the sea. And like, that is surprising to me. I grew up on the west coast of Canada. There's a small Jewish community, but in my hometown there was no organized Jewish community, let alone Yiddishkeit, right? And there is some there. There was some there then. There is a little bit more there now, but it was not a world I grew up in. My father is a musician, and he was playing klezmer when I was growing up. So the music was familiar as an aesthetic that was around me, but I was not really contextually aware of what it was, other than I knew he was playing klezmer music. And so when I first was introduced to all of this, it was at my first CLES Canada in 2003.
Mine too.
Dan's first CLES Canada as well. We were looking, before we started recording, we were looking at our scholarship photo from 2003, which is iconic to us, at least. Whether it's iconic to anyone who's not in the photo is another story, but,
there you go.
Personally iconic. And so iconic for me that I include it in the introduction of my dissertation to help me define the cohort I'm speaking about.
Yeah, it does a good job of that.
So for me, I ended up at CLES Canada for the first time through my father. And it was literally and figuratively life-changing. I mean, it altered the entire, well, who knows about the entire, but it altered the course of my life between then and now, and has shaped every aspect of who I am since then. Quite literally, in terms of friendships, in terms of where I live in the world, in terms of where I've moved in the world, in terms of my scholarship, in terms of my artistic practice, in terms of the books I'm reading. And, it is hard to identify a part of my life that it has not touched. And of course, while that CLES Canada started with that change, it is not limited to CLES Canada, in that I feel myself part of a network, an international network of community and events. But it really, it was the first time that I felt Jewish, rather than just knew that I was, that I had Jewish heritage. Before that, I understood myself to have Jewish heritage, but I had never really identified with it. And at CLES Canada that year, I felt a deep sense of cultural identification, and including things that suddenly made sense for the first time. Like, for example, I was suddenly surrounded by people cracking jokes that sounded like the jokes my dad makes. The sense of humor, not just jokes, but like just the sense of witticism, language play, ways of using language towards humor. And I was like, I understood that in a new way. And I thought, like, I am part of a family here that I had not experienced until then. So that was a tremendous shift. Now, to sort of pull it back forwards to the last few years of doing this study, I think that for me, I really love thinking about what it is that we're doing, and thinking, I've always tried to think deeply about what it is I'm doing, but putting it within a wider context of other cultural movements, of other moments in Jewish history, of other folk scenes, of conversations about decolonialization, about who we are as settlers on the land, about our role in carrying culture forwards. And I think that, I do see in our cohort, not limited to our cohort, but I do see in our cohort a deep sense of responsibility towards form, towards understanding form, context, history, so that we can move forwards and backwards at the same time. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
And this, I will say that, that is an idea that I really took and ran with. I want to give credit to that idea, which it came from an interview with Zoe Aqua, in which she told me about getting really excited about klezmer and starting to compose new work and how she could carry it forwards. And then being in a lesson with Deborah Strauss, who said, well, what are you doing to carry it backwards? Right? Mm-hmm. So that we're constantly moving forwards and backwards at the same time and pulling in two directions. And of course, because of my deep relationship and work with Klez Canada, it's hard to think about that without bringing the Backwards March into it, and the amazing work of Jenny Romaine in bringing the Backwards March to Klez Canada and developing it there, and how are we moving forwards and backwards at the same time? Always in our work with Yiddish culture. We are always looking at where this culture is going, but we are never doing so without reaching backwards and carrying our roots with us. They may change, they may alter, they may evolve, but it is a living, vibrant process, not a process that is only defined by rupture. And so to bring it back to where, the last few years of thinking about this has brought me is to really dig into what that process is. What does it look like to go forwards and backwards at the same time? And then how do I bring that into my work as a dancer, as a dance leader, as a dance teacher? And also my background is really in theater as well, right? So how does that look as I look forward into the art that I would like to make in the future? How does that change the art that I want to make in the future, right? I'm no longer thinking about what I do in quite the same way.
I think that this idea of looking backwards, at least, is as a part of looking forwards, is something that I have felt, whether articulated or not, as a big difference between me and a lot of my peers who are in musical scenes where is there no need to look backwards? It's just not the same. It's not the same. There's sort of no need to it's sort of going, like, the gears are turning on their own to enough extent that you kind of just. And maybe this is an artificially inflated sense of responsibility that maybe or at least I think I'm not the only one in our cohort who feels that way, about having to sort of keep the tradition alive in a sense of doing things in our own version of the old way, like the way I still think you can pick holes in any of these things I'm about to say, but I like to tell people the reason, let's say you want to make crazy new music, the reason to really get into the tradition is because you're going to find the most fertile soil to grow your own thing. You're not going to just take like the top layer of something, you're going to find a lot of richness. And the more you go in, the more richness you have to play with. And I think it's, my bias is clearly towards people who I've perceived doing that. And, there's always exceptions, random people who pop into your life one way or the other. And you're like, how did you get so far into making this something really interesting so fast? And that's something you have to accept about life. But, I think one of the things that your origin story, and I think my origin story is very similar, is like it's such a lightning bolt at the beginning, like this flash out of the blue, that just knocks you on your ass and goes, whoa, I think I got to spend a lot of time here. And then, 20 years later pass, and then you're like, oh, right. How about that?
And then you're like, maybe I've spent too much time here.
Yeah, you got to maintain a variety of practices for sanity. I think what's cool is that for me, there have been so many small changes along the way, like small, like not lightning bolts, these sort of slower things, especially about, for me, how I'm able to carry myself with a certain level of like self-satisfaction, confidence, authority, whatever you want to call it, either as a musician or as a Jewish person. Those are two places where I've noticed over time these the evolution of my involvement in Yiddishkeit has really created an incredibly strong platform for that, as fraught and complicated as it always is. But yeah, do you remember any like slow burns for yourself?
Well, the confidence thing is an interesting question because that has been a slow burn for myself and continues to be challenging. I feel completely at home and confident within the Yiddish cultural world, and it has become a home to me. And it's actually one of the things I see in our community that I find so inspiring is this real dedication to fostering both the social and the professional infrastructure of the community, right? Like we are creating spaces for us to be at home as well as creating spaces for performance and to teach in. But there are ways in which I still very much feel like I have imposter syndrome as far as Jewishness goes. And I think that speaks to one of the strengths of our community in that it embraces so many different ways of being Jewish, which has been a slow burn for me, seeing that diversity of who considers themselves at home within the Yiddish cultural community, because there are other Jewish spaces in which, like, now I've been in this scene now for 20 plus years. Like, I still don't know most of the prayers that most of my peers grew up with, right? Whether in, modern Hebrew or Ashkenazi Hebrew or whatever, I just don't know them. I didn't grow up with them. And there are times when I'm like humming along and don't know the words where I'm like, well, I feel like an imposter, right? That's a painful thing to feel when you've really given your life to working in Jewish community. And at the same time, in Yiddish cultural spaces, that mostly feels okay. It mostly feels like, because we are a diverse group of Jews and non-Jews, it feels okay to hum along rather than know the words, and that I don't feel less than in that space. But I think, that has been a constant challenge, the feeling of being both an insider and an outsider at the same time. And then another thing that has been very much a slow burn, in your words, has been really a growing appreciation for the ways that so many artists in the Yiddish cultural scene are intertwining a commitment to socially engaged cultural practice into their Yiddishkeit, and vice versa, intertwining Yiddishkeit into their commitment to socially engaged cultural practice, and how that is part of a legacy of that work, right? Rather than a new movement. And that has been something that I didn't necessarily see at the beginning, but in part through, in the many hats I've worn at Class Canada for over the years. I was the scholarship coordinator for about 15 years, and in particular through reading 15 years of interest statements from people about why they want to come to Class Canada, seeing that emerge has been really beautiful and exciting. And then the last thing that is emergent for me is the understanding of tradition as the thing that evolves rather than the thing from which we come. And there is, one of the sort of truisms I came to as I tried to write about tradition was that the only way to talk about tradition is through metaphor. Like, ask anybody what tradition means to them, and they always have to default to a metaphor. I heard it is a salad on which we put our own toppings. It's, a cake that we decorate. We have a family recipe that goes down, but we may change it if we're vegan, right? We may use coconut oil instead of butter, or, a Jewish community may move from Eastern Europe to Mexico and suddenly have vibrant ingredients, right?
Yes.
People used a lot of food metaphors and plant metaphors to describe tradition. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of using tradition in place of authenticity or origin, whereas, it's much harder to pin down than that. And I've come to see tradition as the change, as the piece that evolves. Which is a bit of a circular thing to wrap your head around. So it's an ongoing wrapping of my head around that idea. But I have a much more sort of entangled understanding of what tradition is than I did 20 years ago, when I had that lightning bolt of, I need to be involved in this scene.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. That's totally great. I love the idea of tradition just being a framework of thinking about things. Just like evolution, I think, is really one of the most powerful frameworks we can just think about how ideas, they change slowly over time through random mutations, sometimes due to internal factors and sometimes due to external factors. And and then some of them survive and some of them don't. And some of the ones that survive make sense, or you can watch nature videos and go, how the heck did that happen? That's the most efficient way of doing things? Really, I don't understand, and it's so, yeah, I think these are all stories, and it's like, because there's no, what I was sort of saying, there's no essence in that. There's no fundamental truth in the past that is separable from the people who were doing it in the places they were doing it. There can't be, because, well, I guess someone could have a different belief system than I do, maybe. But at least with culture, let's say, that's the deal. It's made by people in the places that it's made, when it's made, and then the next time you make it, it's changing.
Right. And spaces like Class Canada, Yiddish New York, Yiddish Summer Weimar, and beyond, right? The places that we come together are the places where we're now gathering to create culture, not just to transmit culture, but to create culture. And they have become really a key part of the ecosystem, is the places in which we gather, right? Because while we are all out there making our own work, it's when we come together that you really see it as a collective. Right. And I think
those lightning bolts.
Exactly. And it's also a shift from the historical creation of culture, in that, the collective may have been within a town, right? So a geographic collective, whereas now we are gathering at these centers. I call them decentered centers because they disappear when they're not when they're not active, right? So the center is Yiddish New York, and then the center is Klez Canada, and then the center is Yiddish Summer Weimar, and then the center is Klezfest London, and then the center is Klezmerkirche, right? Like it's a center that it moves around. But at each of those spaces, there's such a diversity of people coming together from different places that it changes culture in a different way. So rather than like necessarily evolving in geographically specific ways as it did historically, and it still does that to some extent, but there is the network has become more globalized in many ways, I guess, to use the lingo of globalization.
That's some lingo. Yeah, that's right. And networking.
Much as I'd like to resist Yiddish culture as part of the globalization process, we ended up there.
It's like, yeah, we got another myth that needs to be interrogated and realize what really is going on, but I actually want to pivot to Yiddish dance just because, as you said, sometimes it gets thrown on the back burner and we should make sure that we get to spend time on it. So one of the, things that you fell in love with right away was the Yiddish dancing. And, if we were going to continue the previous conversation, we would be talking about, I think the next topic for me would be how the specific things we do in our tiny niche are the same as or connect us to things that other people have been doing in a lot of different ways. Whether it's even building a sense of Jewish identity on its own that happened in a certain time period that coincides with sort of the birth of the quote-unquote klezmer revival, or other kind of folk revivals of, the last 100 years or something like that. But, and just to connect these two, it's like you came to Yiddish dance with a pretty strong folk dance background. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I came.
And so what happened?
Well, so when I first came to Klez Canada, I struggled against it slightly because, my dad said, let's go to this place. And I said, I don't speak Yiddish. I don't play an instrument. I'm going to be the only young person there. I don't want to go. None of those things mattered because I wasn't the only young person there. I had all the stereotypes in my head, right? And
that's right.
And interestingly, those are still stereotypes that, 20 years later, those are still things that I hear from people when I talk about Klez Canada. So, it's still something that we have to push against. However, within my own identity, my own story, I was not a musician, but I had a background in folk dance and a background in theater, recently emerging from a adolescent obsession, well, more than adolescent, but until then, lifelong obsession with musical theater, as is,
sounds great.
As one should.
As one did.
So, I went to the dance classes and I went to the song classes. And, I studied with Joanne Bortz and Adrienne Cooper, and I studied with Michael Alpert and Zev Feldman. Those were the defining teachers of my first year at Klez Canada. I think I may have done a few other things, but most of my time was spent with those four teachers. And for the first few years that I was there, the first 3 years I was a scholarship student. So in those 3 years, I took dance classes and song classes. And Yiddish dance felt very natural to me. I did come out of a folk dance background. I'd been part of different folk dance performance groups. I'd grown up going to international folk dance sessions with my father and stepmother, and it was a natural extension of that. So it was very easy for me, and it just sort of made sense in an embodied way. I was dancing the forms before I was studying the forms. But that led me to a much deeper study, ongoing mentorship, particularly with Michael Alpert, doing more engaged research. And I began teaching dance at Klez Canada in 2006, and very quickly started teaching internationally, and which also gave me the opportunity to study internationally, right? As soon as you're able to travel to teach, you're able to also learn from the places you go to. And so it quickly became part of my Jewish identity, and it often felt like when I was dancing, when I was doing Yiddish dance, that was the time in which I was most Jewish. Right? Like that was the moment when those were the times when I understood my body as a Jewish body more than any other form. Because if I'm singing, if in Yiddish song classes, I'm still like wrestling with a language that I'm unfamiliar with, though I've gone on to study Yiddish. So, but it's still, I'm not fluent. So there's still getting my mouth around the language, which is still an intellectual part of singing Yiddish song, right?
Yeah.
And whereas Yiddish dance just felt like something I was being in addition to what I was doing. It was a being of Yiddishkeit in a way that felt natural to me. And and that's not to say that I didn't have to study it as well, but when I was actually dancing, I was not intellectualizing it in the same way that I was with other forms. The intellectualization was happening when I was not on the dance floor. And I've been doing Yiddish dance at a very interesting time. If we say, I started to teach in 2006, it's now 2025.
2025,
right? So
yeah, we made
20 years. And in that time, Yiddish dance has gone from something that was largely sidelined within the klezmer revival to something that is very, very much centered at almost all of the events that I know of. Thanks very much to the work of, Michael and Zev and Steve and Deb and Helen and Eve and Jill and, so many other people. But I've also been part of that process, which has been
you too.
An honor, really. And it's now been so many years that I can look and see how Yiddish dance has changed in that time. So just to give you one example of what I see as a major shift in the form itself, when I started doing Yiddish dance at Klez Canada, there were aspects of the dance that were still very much being taught in a gendered way. So this is women's style and this is men's style. And in fact, when I first started teaching, I was asked to demonstrate and teach women's style as part of what I was doing, because I had learned quote unquote women's style from Michael and Zev, right? So,
how about that?
But over the years, in part due to my teaching style, but not only, I put myself within a map of other Yiddish dance teachers, that mode of teaching has fallen away until we are learning a larger vocabulary of stylistic components that include what might have been historical women's style or historically more common to women dancers and male dancers, but we're not learning them as this is how you dance now. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's the changes in pedagogy, but the presence and incredible momentum and contributions of queer Yiddishkeit to the Yiddish cultural scene have been part of the change in direction of Yiddish dance as well. There's also definitely been a shift towards more Yiddish dance leaders who identify as women or non-binary, and so there, there is less desire to dance in a gendered way. And
Right.
and it makes sense that if I'm learning from Michael and Zev and I see them doing sort of fun, boot slapping or kicks, and then I'm told, well,
Yeah.
that's not your style, right? It's like,
Well, that's
no, I'm
wrong
just gonna
because you're
like
you know how to wear a boot.
exactly, and whether I'm wearing boots or heels does change the way I
No,
dance,
totally.
but
Well, how about that?
but it
Natural.
yeah, but that's natural, and I get to choose my vocabulary based on how I'm feeling in the moment, and my footwear based on how
Yeah.
I'm feeling in the moment.
As we should all be able
So
to.
that's a major, well, one of the many shifts that I've seen in the Yiddish dance scene. But you connected it in your question. You also connected it into the other forms. Like it was in many ways sidelined or taught separately for a long time, and over the last 20 years, particularly, has become more integrated into the way we teach Yiddish music, klezmer music, Yiddish culture generally. Um, and I think that that is both necessary and vital to the ways we understand the culture as a whole, or as a messy entanglement of different cultural practices. And for
Yeah.
example, you know, in klezmer music, we speak about the heterophonic qualities of a klezmer ensemble, right? This idea that there is like one voice that through ornamentation and personal improvisation gets becomes many voices, but not many harmonic voices, right?
That's right.
Did I do that? Did I define that okay?
It's
Okay,
great. Yeah, no, it's just we're all doing the same thing in our own way at the same
there we
time, and it
go.
adds up to a beautiful whole.
Right.
Kind of, but it's actually a great metaphor for that whole messy cultural thing of many different, because it's like each instrument has their sort of own traditional approach to
Exactly.
the melody, and so it's like, and that's why you should look back to tradition, because then you get to like sort of live in this whole big mess because you have a sense of where you fit.
Exactly. So
You know?
look, hearing that word thrown around within the klezmer music scene, I made the same leap you just did and thought, wow, this feels like a metaphor for everything we do. And not
Sure.
just a metaphor, but an apt description. And also, it is how I understand Yiddish dance as well, right? So, Zev Feldman writes about the two major impulses of Eastern European Jewish dance being sort of collective choreography and individual expression in an improvisational way, and how that those two impulses combine in Yiddish dance in fairly unique ways. And so I thought, well, this is exactly the same thing, right? But feeling like heterophony didn't quite capture the application in a Yiddish folk dance setting, I coined heterogestic. And I got to that through considering a lot of different words, including heterochoric or heterochoreographic, and thinking about what were the different things that I wanted to speak to with the word. And the idea of heterogestic is that even when we are dancing as a community, so for instance, in a Freilach or in a Bulgar, there are individual expressions, individual improvisations and ornamentations that happen within the community choreography, right? You can vary the steps.
Even in the circle, not just in the middle of the circle,
Exactly,
right?
within the circle.
Yeah.
So, and not just the leader, but anybody within the line can vary the step of the Bulgar as long as you're within the group rhythm.
Yeah.
Right. And so thinking about those variations, those ornamentations as gestures, whether they are gestures of the face, of the arms, of the feet, led me to heterogestic. So it's been fun to think about that as a counterpart to heterophonic, right?
Right. No, it totally makes sense. And it's what I love about it is that that you have the sense of improvisation and group choreography, which is something akin to, let's say, a composition. In other words, something that already previously existed and something that you're going to make up on the spot, both completely and based on everything from the past. And, this is that's the kind of musician I like, is the people who can kind of, spread that line out. And what's funny is that, especially dealing with bands of people who are, let's say a little more glued to the page, is, we rehearsed, this was specific in I run a community band at Cult Sedek Synagogue in West Philly. And it was great because they've, a person in Philly who studied with Steve Weintraub, Miriam Coppersmith, has been doing a lot of dance classes, and people are getting more familiar with this stuff, and means that more people are showing up to do the dances, which means that it ruins your ability to get stuck in the page as a musician. You have to get off. You can't even keep the forms that we decided to before, because it's this just happened a couple days ago at Purim. We had a short little Freilock's Hustle-ish, medley to start us out. And I should have known better, because this happens every time. As soon as people start dancing, I was like, well, we're going to have to play this tune 6 times because we're not ready to play another tune. Whereas if it was me and people who aren't on the page and who are just sort of using their own internal songbooks, we might have played anywhere from 3 to 7 tunes or something. I remember one gig in early 2024 with Jake Schulman, where for whatever reason, he was in a mood to only play every tune once. And so we went through dozens of tunes in the course of this gig, and it was hilarious because we were on it. It was, it felt like drag racing or something, like a high risk, kind of sport or something like that. But it comes back to that interaction. It's there has to be this interaction. And that's why, it has to be an oral tradition. It has to be a flexible tradition in order to create the continuity, the connection between the dance. And, if you've ever been on stage at a Cluz Canada, when you're up on the stage in that old gym back in Camp B'nai B'rith, and it looked like nature patterns of swirling eddies of water or something like that. These circles going around, the snaking lines. And I also know, being on the floor in those too, you're just whether you're literally high-fiving the person next to you as you go by, Steve style, or doing it, just seeing all the people around you. It is an incredibly potent experience. It's a serious experience.
It is. One of the things we've sort of danced around in this conversation is the diversity of reasons that people engage with Yiddish culture, work with Yiddish culture, come to Yiddish culture, and simultaneously the breaking down of myths, right? And I think there can be a collective myth that we're all here for the same reason, which we need to critically examine. But I do think that the Yiddish cultural scene, the coming together is what makes Yiddishland. So just as in a dance, it's like me taking your hand to form in the line of dancing that creates the Yiddish dance, right? Or in a tune, it's, several of you joining together in a jam that creates the musical moment. Yiddishland as a conceptual space is formed by people coming together. It's formed by the relational acts between people, and it's dependent on those, right? It's dependent on that interaction, whether it's interaction between people or interaction between a person and a text or a tune or a dance. It is formed by relational interactions between people and things, people and materials, and people and people. And out of those interactions, we create this beautiful, ideological space of Yiddishland.
Where a lot of cool music and cool dancing and scholarship, and also just great teaching. There are just loads of incredible teachers, And that is not true everywhere. I mean, I just want to say it's remarkable. And I think but it's right. Like, it kind of fundamentally comes down for me that we choose this pursuit, but we also choose each other. You know, if you're going to go to a Class Canada, you got to live with these people for a week. You know, Class Camp was even more claustrophobic because you didn't really go outside. It was cold, you know, and like I mean, many weeks at Class Camp, many years over the course of the whatever 10, 13 Class Camps I did, I didn't go outside for an entire minute because I was just playing all the time. And it's like, yeah, for people like us, we chose it because when we encountered it, the bolt of lightning came down and completely changed our nervous systems, or we discovered the thing that we were always looking for, or whatever version of the story feels most relevant to that time. So the choice was easy, but it was still a choice.
It was.
And we've made...
Yeah, and I think also it is a choice that we continually make, and it's also there's also a choice in how we come together. So in the ways we choose to be together as community, we're actually defining our heritage and defining the way we understand Yiddish culture, and that, you know, I see Class Canada. Well, one of the many ways I see Class Canada is as a space that is both very much part of the world around it, in that we can't ever leave our world, right? But it is also an othered space. It is a space set apart, and that gives us an opportunity to be in community in really special ways, and in many ways practice and rehearse and try out the ways that we'd like to be in community beyond the borders of Class Canada, right? It's a space of rehearsal. Right. It's a space of discovery, of new strategies, of pedagogy, of putting things together in new ways, and then we can take all of that potential and apply it in different ways to our everyday life, to the other events we create, to the performances we make, in really exciting ways. So I really see that is a unique, special aspect of spaces like Class Canada, in particularly the spaces that feel like retreats, but also the retreats within urban spaces as well. You know, they all function a little bit differently, but anytime that we are together in that kind of intensity, we're provided with this opportunity to try things out, and we get to make choices
well
about
said,
that.
Avia.
Yeah,
that's right. Especially those of us who are in leadership roles like yourself, and I just thought that was just a remarkably succinct way of wrapping things up. So we could pause it there, but also if there's anything else that you feel like we didn't cover that you'd like to talk about, feel free.
You know, I think the last thing I would bring up, which is a question that wasn't central to my dissertation, but came up at the beginning and the end, which was the question of whether we are post-revival. And I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think the question is really important. And, you know, when I mentioned that question to Michael Alpert, he said, well, we're still reviving. But when I've spoken to some of the younger members of the community, who I think of as maybe like the next generation after our cohort, the next cohort.
Yeah.
I think generations are a bit problematic within our scene because we're so intergenerational.
Age has very little to do with it.
But the next cohort, I've heard from some of them that they feel like we are in a post-revival space. So, but asking the question feels really important. And even though I don't think there's an answer, and I think that one of the reasons it's important is to bring us back to the beginning and talk about post-vernacularity, is this idea of what does it mean to have something be post, right? And post, in the way it's used in scholarship, doesn't mean that the thing that came before it no longer exists. So, for instance,
right.
post-colonialism is not the end of colonialism. Unfortunately. Yeah. But that's important to recognize, is that post-colonialism is a different lens through which we look at continued oppression and colonial acts, right? Same thing, post-vernacularity does not mean the end of vernacularity, which is another critique of post-vernacularity, of the post-vernacular. So, but it does mean that there is continuation with a change, right? So, someone, and I'm forgetting the citation here, so please excuse me, described the post.
You're allowed on the podcast.
As a post-it note. So you stick the post-it note onto the word. So we have the vernacular, and then we have the post-vernacular. And it's not that the vernacular Yiddish no longer exists, but we're also operating in a world with a post-it on it, right? Same thing, I think, with the revival. What happens when we stick a post-it note on it, right? So the revival is continuing, but there's also been a shift. And I think that the shift is pretty undeniable. So to think about post-revival is to think about a continuation with change. And I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the markers of that change, right? Not for any one particular cohort, but for the Yiddish cultural scene in its larger, many-legged, many-sphered approach to Yiddishkeit. So that's I guess the question that I'd like to leave people with is, I have my own thoughts about what the markers of the current moment are, but I think that it's an important thing for people to be asking and asking themselves and each other.
Absolutely, Avia. And guess what? For those listening, one of the responses to the question is to make some decisions and then just see where they lead you. That's what we've done. And that's what we learned to do from the people who inspired us. So anyway, Avia, thanks so much for being part of this. I'm so glad that in this current time period, you and I get to spend a lot of FaceTime together. It hasn't always been that way, but we are connected through this moment that we both entered this forever, as far as I'm concerned. So
connected through the 2003 scholarship photograph.
That's correct. Exactly. Yes. And then the many years since. And I'm just glad for all this time together. And it's great to talk to you and hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. Likewise, I'm so grateful for our community, both in our smaller cohort, which feels very tied together in so many ways, but also for the larger family, the chosen family of this space. Constantly grateful. So, thank you.
Du liebe Freund, bevor scheino,
Well, that was my conversation with Avia Moore. Talking with Avia was just so great and such a wonderful way, and I'll just use the phrase, to nerd out. And that's what I am. I'm an unabashed nerd for Yiddish world, for Yiddish culture, for klezmer music. I'm obsessed, and I'm so glad that I'm not the only one. I love being able to share my obsession with so many people and then talk about what it all means with incredibly intelligent, thoughtful, people who have done so much hard work to figure all it out and have useful things to say about it, like Avia. This was awesome. I love that we talked about how deep it is that we've chosen this and that we continue to choose this path in our lives. If you haven't signed up for Klez Canada already, you probably should if you are anybody like me, or even like a quarter like me, you're going to have an incredible time. So that's coming up in August. And stay tuned for more from us. As always, we could use your support. Patreon.com/radiantothers. And whatever other ways you can think to support us. Bring us to do an event. I don't know. Talk to me or my producer, Bela, who I'm always grateful for their work. And in the meantime, enjoy this and all of our other episodes. And have a good Shabbos.
Sei morgen heut, sei schkie klor, do is mein Heim. In ein Klang wie sing sa huis, ahu, ahu. Und achte schön von dem Arois, do is mein Heim. Sei heuschig, sei kajor, ahu, ahu. Sei morgen groi, sei schkie klor, do is mein Heim. Verbinden wir Sach mit ein Klang, ahu, ahu. Bleibt damit unser Herzgesang, do is mein Heim. Sei heuschig, sei kajor, ahu, ahu. Sei morgen heut, sei schkie klor, do is mein Heim. Unser nekide Singerei, ahu, ahu. In Weltretome klingen frei, do is mein Heim. Sei heuschig, sei kajor, ahu, ahu. Sei morgen heut, sei schkie klor, do is mein Heim. Sei heuschig, sei